Talking to Cornelius, Conversation 6. Having joined the Emily at Deptford on the 13th of June 1844, the medical stores were embarked. The guard, consisting of 51 men, 2 officers, and 18 of the families, were embarked on the 14th, and she sailed on the 15th of June for Kingston Harbour, Dublin, where the prisoners were to be embarked. On arriving there, the prisoners had not arrived from the county jails. We were detained till the 13th of July, when the last of the prisoners were embarked, 205 male and 1 child. We sailed on Sunday, the 14th of July, the prisoners and crew being previously mustered by the proper authorities. John Munro was the surgeon on board the Emily too. He had to keep a journal covering the months at sea. It wasn't just a record of illnesses and their treatments. He also had to record the disposition of convicts, the problematic characters and how they were dealt with, the day-to-day routines focused on maintaining hygiene and health, and the efforts to provide education to men whose claims of being able to read and write often fell short of the mark when put to the test. There was a medical drama on board while the Emily was still in Kingston Harbour. William Dewhurst, a 21-year-old soldier, started vomiting blood and complained of a severe headache. Munro responded with the instincts of a typical 19th century physician. He drew blood, which caused further nausea, and then treated the young man with tinctures of opium and wine. Dewhurst remained in sickbay long after the Emily weighed anchor and started its journey south. He wasn't discharged back to duty until the 20th of October. The drama increased to a crescendo once the Emily crossed the Irish Sea and headed south past Portugal. I think about you, old man, in those first days on the open ocean when you were still kept below decks. 17 years old, penned up in the belly of a groaning timber beast, feeling the dislocation of every pitch and roll, the heady upward surge, the moment of suspension, the plummet and crash, the unending violent rhythm of timber smashing into water. And every wave begged the question, what will it take for this ship to break and death to come surging in? In those moments, there must have been an extra sense of tyranny in the binding weight of the irons. There was no getting out of them. There was no swimming to freedom. Those heavy irons guaranteed death. Munro said the rough conditions went on for several days. It must have felt like there would be no end to being jostled back and forth, head dizzy, skin clammy, guts churning. The sound of other men vomiting filled your ears. The acid stench assaulted your nostrils, and the feverish intensity reached deep, squeezed your insides until you gave it all up, part of a chorus of vomit and despair, and the floors of the cells were covered with it. Munro admitted it was almost impossible to keep the cells clean at that time. Some of the old men, in particular, from the interior of Ireland, never having seen the sea or a ship before, suffered extremely and were in such a state of despondency that I was afraid they would sink altogether. They required much nursing and encouragement to enable them to bear up against their position. They seemed to suffer much from the loss of their tobacco, to which all of them had been accustomed. 2 old men in particular, without the occasional use of tobacco, I am of opinion, would not have reached their destination. The experience of transportation wasn't a common experience. It was different for every man and boy on board. Being on a ship must have been nothing short of hell for those old men who barely knew the world beyond their villages, who had never laid eyes on the ocean, and who knew nothing of its many vigorous moods. By our standards, the men weren't particularly old. They were countrymen in their 50s who stole livestock or potatoes. There were no convicts on board in their 60s or 70s. There was an old man on board by our standards, an 84-year-old convict, a Protestant clerk and servant named Robert Dillon, who obtained money on a forged order. The surgeon Munro later observed that some of the old men couldn't speak English, so there was an extra layer of cultural dislocation and trauma in their experience. They had been judged and sentenced according to a foreign law and by a foreign tongue. Now they were in the wretched depths of a foreign system and thrown into the turmoil of a rough ocean crossing. Some, no doubt, cried out in despair, wanting to be heard and understood. Others murmured their prayers. Gui urin na pake, pray for us sinners. Si shin ok, deliver us from evil. These old men in their Gaelic-speaking despair represented a core truth about the Irish experience. They were a people who had been invaded, forced off their land, culturally suppressed, politically and socially disempowered, and judged primitive and untrustworthy by a foreign power. The Irish on the Emily were on a journey from their invaded native land. They were heading south to the invaded territory of another people. Many of the 51 soldiers on board, all members of the 58th Regiment, the Rutlandshire Regiment of Foot, were well acquainted with sea journeys. They were men who could be sent to any corner of the British Empire. Some on board had certainly served in Ceylon, and many, after arriving in Australia, were destined to fight and settle in New Zealand. Their service as prison guards on board the Emily was a pragmatic arrangement. A safe arrival relied on well-controlled routines at sea. Convicts needed to eat, sleep, shit, bathe, work, gain some degree of education and exercise. The routine was kept to a minimum on the rough days. But on fine days, convicts were portioned into manageable numbers and assigned their activities. The business of transporting convicts had been well tuned over the decades since the disastrous journey of the Second Fleet to Sydney. The Second Fleet proved that a bad outcome was certain when the lives of convicts were handed over to unregulated private operators with a single-minded focus on maximising their profits. Successful transportation relied on regulation and accountability as directed and recorded by men like John Munro. Once the Emily was at sea, passing North Africa, Munro recorded that the irons were removed from all those who conducted themselves well, they being given to understand that this was an indulgence and only to be continued during their good conduct. When the prisoners had generally recovered from their seasickness and were able to attend to the general regulations for cleanliness, they were told off into 3 divisions, and a list of each hung in the prison. When the prison doors were opened in the morning, the whole of the prisoners were had on deck by divisions to wash their persons, which was completed by breakfast time. And after breakfast, the prison deck was carefully cleaned with dry sand and stones, with chief efforts being directed to keep it dry. It was minutely inspected by me every day, and the boatswain of the prisoners and his assistant, and soon got into the way of keeping it in very good order. After breakfast, the prisoners were allowed upon deck separately in divisions, and dancing, single sticks, and other amusements encouraged amongst them. I have to tell you, in all the years I've spent imagining the experience of seaborne convict transportation, I never imagined dancing might be part of the daily routine, but now I imagine a herd of men under the watchful eye of soldier guards, stomping around, breathing in salt air and feeling the sun on their bodies, one man deciding to really get into it, and then others following his lead, kicking up legs, knees up and down, making the deck thump to their rhythm. Maybe they danced to the sound of a musician. Maybe they danced to their own songs, songs in the old language, songs with a spark of rebel defiance, or songs with a thread of Celtic melancholy. What a thing to imagine, a ship full of convicts dancing their way south, past Africa and South America. And it's not just the dancing that derails my standard idea of convict travel. Munro also mentioned single sticks, a kind of fencing with long sticks rather than swords. It was a slightly refined version of the stick fighting that had landed some of the men on a ship to Australia in the first instance. Now, it was an acceptable form of exercise. I wonder if anyone dared take on one of those notorious Gilligan brothers who had murdered a man with sticks.